Hello and welcome back to another books video. This is going to be about the books that I read for the month of August. I read 3 books that I'm going to be talking about, but before we dive into that, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to one of my viewers from last month's video. So thank you, Tim, for watching the video and leaving a comment. So the first book that I want to talk about is called 9 Lives in Search of the Sacred in Modern India. It's written by William Dalrymple in 2009. And this is a nonfiction book. It has 9 chapters. Each chapter is kind of a profile or the story of someone in India keeping alive certain religious traditions. You can tell that the author has gone further afield and is trying to identify stories that are more provincial, that have more folklore to them, and he's not as interested in kind of focusing on the large urban experience. I kind of get the sense, knowing that he's a journalist, that this maybe is the culmination of his many years of reporting in India and the different stories and people that he's collected throughout his career. There are several chapters that follow the lives of performers and artists who are tied to key religious traditions. So, for example, there's a chapter about dancers who, when they dance, actually come to embody particular gods or goddesses. There's a chapter around an idol maker. So he's a Brahmin who is creating idols to be used in processions and parades. There's a chapter around someone who sings this great oral epic. This book, I think, was really helpful for me just to get a little bit deeper into India. As someone who's really more of a China and Southeast Asia person, I know embarrassingly little about India. I actually have never even been to India, which I really want to change in the near future. I read this book with my book club, so we did discuss some themes that came out across the different chapters. I don't think that the author put in much effort into really spelling out these themes. In fact, in the introduction, he talks about wanting to make sure that the voice of the person he's profiling comes forward as much as possible, which I did appreciate. He was trying to acknowledge his identity as like a white Western journalist. So the chapters are actually almost like transcripts of the conversations that he's having with these people. He does provide some descriptions of some prose that kind of gets you into the feeling of things and provides some context. Some of the themes that we found interesting, I think number one, a key theme was that a lot of the cultural traditions that these communities have that I think are very valuable, if we do value heritage and tradition, are really closely tied to a localized form of religion. And so as India, through colonization and after colonization, moved to a more national articulation of Hinduism and other religions, you really do threaten the existence of these more local traditions and local religious practices, which are really focused more on devotion to or worshiping of specific gods or goddesses. Another really interesting thing to pick up on is obviously the influence of the caste system in India. So, for example, the dancers that he talks about, these are the dancers of Kannur, which is in Kerala. It's essentially the lower caste that does these performances, and the upper caste will come and worship and give praises to who they think are actual gods. And it's a kind of subversion of the caste system, which I think leads to more social cohesion because there's some sort of pressure valve for the frustrations and the injustices that are being dealt on the lower caste to have a space and to come to the fore. I think my main conclusion is that it's really a collection of New Yorker articles. I think one of them actually is even a New Yorker article. And so the formula for each chapter is very predictable. It's that type of New Yorker style of writing where there's always a circle kicker, there's something that ties in the introduction to the conclusion, or there's some kind of revelation or emotional impact that happens to you towards the end. And so it can be kind of tedious to read 9 of those in a row. I did read this like the week before my book club was meeting, and so I think that was was particularly apparent to me. I will give it a 3.8 out of 5. I think overall a nice read, something to kind of whet my palate and get me more interested in India. I don't think I have the bandwidth to read more about a different country yet, but it was good to kind of have this in the back of my mind. Okay, I am obsessed with this next book, so I'm going to try super hard to keep this succinct. I think there are so many ideas in here that I've really grappled with. Some of them I agree with, some of them I disagree with, but the writing style and the type of writing that it is super intriguing to me. And in another life, if I was ever an author, this is the kind of stuff I would want to write. So you probably have already heard of this book. It's called Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. This book came out in 2019. Gia Tolentino is a staff writer for The New Yorker, but she's done a lot of pieces in Jezebel, various online blogs. Before she was a writer, she was in the Peace Corps, and she's from Texas. And so she describes this book as a collection of essays that are about the spheres of public imagination that have shaped my understanding of myself, of this country, and of this era. There are 9 essays. They're each about 30 pages. The reason I love this writing so much is it's thoughtful and it's deep, and there are no bite-sized takeaways. It's really Gia grappling with these concepts and phenomena that she sees and trying to work it out for herself. Some of the essays are highly personal and take on more of a memoir style. Some of the essays really rely on other bodies of work and other research that she's done, and she's kind of just reacting or teasing out her take on already existing theories. She has such a strong personal voice as well, and I think that is the type of writing I would aspire to accomplish. It just seems like the best job in the world. And I'm sure someone somewhere has called Gia Tolentino like the voice of her generation, which is like a very lofty thing to call a writer, but it does help describe her project. Like, you can tell through these essays, she is trying to, not that she's trying to embody the voice of her generation, but the work that she does in reacting and researching and writing and teasing these things out culminates in something that really is reflective of the time that we live in and her identity as a young woman. The first essay that I want to talk about is called Always Be Optimizing, and you can really feel Tolentino's anxiety around the state of capitalism in the US today. But the focus of this chapter is really about the forces and pressure on women to be an optimal version of themselves. The main idea that Tolentino has in this essay is, even if we've progressed from the social pressures of, say, the 1950s of what an ideal woman should look like, those strictures have just morphed into a new prison. Even glossy women's magazines now model skepticism toward top-down narratives about how we should look, who and when we should marry, how we should live. But the psychological parasite of the ideal woman has evolved to survive in an ecosystem that pretends to resist her. If a woman starts to resist an aesthetic, like the overapplication of Photoshop, the aesthetic just changes to suit us. The power of the ideal image never actually wanes. Taking something that limited the freedom of a woman's power to define herself, for example, you need to be a housewife, or you shouldn't work, or you need to look a certain way, which in essence are directions or instructions from the patriarchy. And updating them or evolving them into new instructions that are kind of wolves in sheep's clothing, I guess, meaning that even things that appear to be feminist at the point where society is telling you should then be that way in order to become society's version of an ideal woman, it is still restrictive, right? And I think the thing that really gets Gia Tolentino's goat, like you can tell this is something that really bothers her through across the essays, is the fact that there's the capitalist element to it. She says, resistance to a system is presented on the terms of the system. It's so much easier when we gain agency to adapt rather than to oppose. Even though there are societal implications to the content that she's discussing, it really is largely focused on beauty standards and how a woman presents herself to society. And my personal take on this is maybe because I'm of a different wave, although I am the same generation as Gia Tolentino, is that in many ways, beauty products and being able to define what I wear and what I put on my face has been a very empowering project, and not even just empowering, but a creative outlet. I mean, it's as simple as I think makeup is fun, but you can really tell that Gia feels differently from this quote in particular. She says, I like trying to look good, but it's hard to say how much you can generally independently like what amounts to a mandate. She is pushing for this concept of beauty neutral. Like, it's not even, so if in the past we had body negativity, like everyone should be skinny and gorgeous and blonde and blue-eyed, and now we have body positivity, which really also ties in with her idea of optimization, which is now we have so much choice. Now we have technology. Now we have spin cycle, what's it called? Soul Cycle and bar classes. So there's no excuse for you not to pick and optimize what is the ideal presentation of yourself to society. And I guess alongside that, body positivity still can be perverted into a system of this is what a curvy woman should look like. This is what a person of color should look like. And I think what she wants instead is something called, she wants rather just a de-emphasization on beauty, full stop. And she calls it being beauty neutral. So the best articulation of this position is in this quote. She says, the freedom I want is located in a world where we wouldn't need to love women or even monitor our feelings about women as meaningful, in which we wouldn't need to parse the contours of female worth and liberation by paying meticulous personal attention to any of this at all. Yeah, and I just feel like that's super naive. It's almost just being like, well, this is a big deal, and maybe if it just disappeared, then it wouldn't be a big deal. And I don't know, like, I get where she's coming from, because I think there is power in just, like, not caring, in every woman deciding for herself how to be self-actualized. But then I also think it's, like, super naive to just present as the solution that we all just pay less attention to something, you know? And this is a common thought that comes up in a lot of her essays. You can really feel that she has this trapped sense in the current system, whatever the system is, patriarchy, capitalism. And I get the feeling that making progress within the system doesn't count as progress for her, which is something I think I disagree with. I think it's something that's very easy to like write about and talk about. Like, insofar as any system of beauty exists, we're still trapped. But I mean, what does that really mean in a day-to-day context? I don't really buy the idea of just because the system itself is broken, we can't have any progress within the system. That's a huge generalization, and it depends on what you're talking about. Sometimes the system really just needs to be completely overhauled, but I feel like for Gia, we're always losing, because no matter what, at the end of the day, we're still in a patriarchal capitalist society. It doesn't sit right with me to say none of this is worth it and there can't be a diversity in interpretations, woman to woman, of how they view the tools and restrictions around them. even if those tools are provided by the system, even if those tools are like in the language of our oppressor. I am definitely open to learning more about this and dismantling more of my beliefs, but I just think, you know, people in a sexist society are sexist. People in a racist society are racist. Like, the system in itself is the milieu in which we exist. And to just say like, oh, well, that's such a fucked up system that like nothing we do and none of the gains that we make in the system count, feels like tautological torture. It's like you're just going to go in circles because we exist in this society that has so many systemic issues. The only thing we can do is to blow up the society and destroy and dismantle the system. But for me, where it gets tricky is like, what does that mean? I think dismantling the system does require steps within the system, especially if by system you mean society. Like, when I like putting on this red eye makeup, is it because it helps me be self-actualized and I'm in control of my identity and I'm making an empowered decision to present myself to the world in a certain way? Or is it because I've internalized patriarchy that says I should care about what other people think in terms of my looks? I believe it's the former, but it could be the latter. And maybe that's just a very, that slippage is very tricky. Certainly there are a large swath of women who, in order to succeed, are stuck in this rat race of societal pressure. Maybe it's because I'm not famous and so I can do whatever I want and it doesn't really matter. And she does have another essay where she talks about how we use celebrities as kind of a proxy. We use celebrities as a way to also evaluate and assess the progress of society, which is just kind of like bizarre, which is a great idea that I love that she talks about. I just think it's hard to differentiate between someone who is trying to get better as a woman as part of a human project and is doing it in a very self-actualized and empowered way, and someone who is trying to become a better woman because of the system of patriarchy and oppression that tells her that she needs to be doing that. I do think like capitalism is pretty messed up, and insofar as we're forced to do things because it's such a rat race, that does seem oppressive, and I can see why she feels anxiety about it. So much money and research dollars and technology, quote unquote, is put into the beauty industry, is put into these marketing campaigns, is put into wooing women as consumers, but there's still like not enough research done into the side effects of hormonal birth control, or there's not enough research being done to translate into policy fixes for policies around childcare. I do think that's a good point. She says something which I think is kind of what I'm trying to get to. So she says, I keep thinking womanhood has been denied depth and meaning for so long that every inch of it is now almost impossibly freighted. Where female difficulty once seemed perverse, the refusal of difficulty now seems perverse. The entire interpretive framework is becoming untenable. We can analyze difficult women from the traditional point of view and find them controversial, and we can analyze bland women from the feminist point of view and find them controversial too. We have a situation in which women reject conventional femininity in the interest of liberation, and then find themselves alternately despising and craving it. Which is to say, maybe every woman needs to decide for herself how to challenge the patriarchy in her own way. But I kind of feel like Tolentino is concluding that because the system in itself is messed up, nothing we can do really has meaning, which I feel like is a very hopeless project. The other essay I want to talk about was just so much fun to read. It's called Pure Heroines, and Tolentino basically goes through a lot of my favorite books, but she goes through the literary canon of women protagonists. A lot of the books for young women, the main character is a human first and a woman second. she's talking about like Laura Ingalls Wilder and Harriet the Spy and like the Judy Blume books. They just have such like a wide-eyed and eager and enthusiastic view of the world from the point of view of the female character. And the young girls are flawed, and they don't really have like this self-realization of moving through the world as a woman, which I thought was a really interesting observation. And then she goes through, like, then we progress to these novels where being a woman is almost like a death sentence, and you start to see, like, so one of my favorite books is The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. A lot of The Bell Jar is all about how, like, the condition of being a woman is so messed up that it kind of drives you to suicide. I had such self-indulgence in reading this essay because it's like Tolentino quoted the exact same passages that I have circled in my copy of The Bell Jar, which probably like thousands of women have circled in their copies of The Bell Jar. Anyway, so her point is you move from that world of unadulterated opportunity as a young girl in literature to the sadness and bitterness, is what she calls it, of adolescence and adulthood, at which point, if you hadn't killed yourself already, you would simply disappear. It's just so, like, indulgent to have someone make such keen observations and well-researched and, like, just really smart comments on books that you also have read and have loved, like, your whole life. And then on top of that is something that's so personal and deeply impactful to me, because as a woman, that's like the lens through which you read that stuff. And she obviously, it had like a really deep impact on her because she's now writing about it. I'm going to give this a 4.9 out of 5. It was so thought-provoking, and I'm so jealous of her mind, and I'm so jealous of her job. It's like I feel like I'm in conversation with the ideas in this book. It's a starting point. It's her take on it, but I could have a conversation about these ideas with anyone forever. So if you've read this, let me know. If you want to talk about it, if you want to talk about any of her ideas in this book, please hit me up. Okay, the last book I'm going to talk about is actually a graphic novel. It's called The Art of Charlie Chan Hock Chye by Sunny Liu. This is part of I'm reading one book about Singapore a month, so this is my book about Singapore. This book is a masterpiece. It's gorgeous. It's such a masterpiece of style and storytelling. It won the Will Eisner Award, which I think is like the best award for graphic novels. Charlie Chan Hock Chye is a fictional cartoon artist from Singapore, and the graphic novel is told as a retrospective of both his art but also the events of his life. It also is a historical account because Charlie Chan had a lot of political leanings in his artwork. Sunny is then able to retell the history of Singapore's independence, pre-independence, and I mentioned in last month's video, it was awkward because it had gained so much international acclaim, but because it presented an alternative history that is not accepted by the PAP and like the ruling government party currently, it was really awkward for them. It tells the story of a lot of events, such as the various student and labor union protests before Lee Kuan Yew was able to consolidate. He talks about Lim Chin Seung, who was a communist and detained, but worked with Lee Kuan Yew in the beginning. He uses different styles of art to convey different stories. One of the comics that Charlie Chan had written earlier in his so-called career is called Ah Huat's Giant Robot, and that's kind of a commentary on the socioeconomic schism in Singapore between the privileged Chinese who spoke English and the poor Chinese who only knew Mandarin and dialects. It also covers the Huazhong and Chengcheng Chinese middle school protests, which were anti-colony, anti-British protests, and were something that originated from the Chinese schools because the English-speaking schools kind of just accepted what the colonial government said, but the Chinese youths were protesting against an order that they would be registered for national service. It's national service for the British government, so they saw it as like colonial conscription. Another comic that the fictional Charlie Chan does is called Invasion. I don't think you're going to be able to see, but it's really an allegory of life in Singapore under British rule. It's a science fiction epic, and there's cartoon versions of LKY and Lim Chin Siong, and they are like the leaders of a resistance group fighting against an alien invasion. And so the aliens are like the British, obviously, and the aliens are called hegemons, and they speak hegemonese, which is English, and the PAP is the Planetary Achievement Party. Another one of the comics that I really liked, these are all comics in Charlie Chan's fictional retrospective of his career, is called Bukit Chapalang. I don't know if you can tell, but it started out as a retelling of Malayan folktales, and basically Charlie Chan uses different characters to signify political parties or political figures. So David Marshall, who was a chief minister under the British administration and part of the Workers' Party, is depicted as an elephant, Sang Gaja the elephant. The British government is a lion. Lim Chin Siong is a cat. The trade unions and the Chinese students that protest are marching ants. And then Sang Kansel, which is the very clever deer mouse, is the avatar for Lee Kuan Yew. In depicting this fictional character's retrospective, like all the art of his career, he is doing the art of all these different styles, and there's sketches in here, there's autobiographical depictions in here, like portraits and stuff. Sunny Leo shows up as a little cartoon character as well to give information and history, so it's like very comprehensive, I would say. But it also just does such a great job of invoking a sense of forlornness and sadness about how things went down at the beginning of Singapore's formation as a country, and that really, really parallels the career of Charlie Chan Hock Chye, because he never gets married. Graphic art and cartoons don't really reach the status of prestige or recognition that he wants. I can't imagine being able to pull all these different layers together and execute it so well and so in such an impactful way. And I really love graphic novels as a medium in general, because the way that these artists can use space and like page turns to really create like emotion and to really communicate a feeling is so cool. This is when his writing partner says he can't do it anymore because they're not making enough money. So you go from like multi-panels to just the one panel, and then you turn and you see Charlie Chan by himself without like his glasses obscuring his face. Like just the impact of like that page turn and like moving from multiple to one. Obviously, like I'm not an art critic, so I don't really know what I'm talking about, but it really did translate to a more compelling and meaningful story. It was just extremely expert and sophisticated, the way that Sunny Leo used this fictional character of Charlie Chan Hock Chye and the evolution of his own medium, like the evolution of cartoons and comics, to tell such a meaningful account of Singapore's founding and all the different political dynamics, the socioeconomic dynamics, the racial tensions, and really the overall tone. It just has this kind of like sad and poignant tone of both the dreams and aspirations of Charlie Chan not being fully realized kind of as a mirror to like the dreams and aspirations of Singapore not being fully realized, despite the fact that it's so successful today and seen, it's the same thing of like, is this just a superficial layer, and trying to dig deeper into what were the conditions and the circumstances that really bred the Singapore of today. So I love this. I will give this a 5 out of 5. And I just am so in awe of someone who can do this artwork and also do the storytelling and do the narrative and create such like the visual storytelling as well as the narrative storytelling is insane. And then he'll just do like an entire oil portrait, It's kind of like he's showing off. So I highly recommend this. It's a bit on the pricier side because it is a work of art, but I think I'm going to put this really high up on my list of an introduction to Singapore in terms of like must reads.